Okay, I might be a little bit late to the party, but now that I'm back from TennoCon, we have to talk about this. The Haalvu, the newest weapon in Warframe. And let me tell you, this thing is not only incredibly unique, but I also found a special synergy that is so busted, it just drowns the entire screen in thousands of status effects. So, after a huge shout out to all our generous channel members, let's check out what exactly is going on here. Just as per usual, let's first start explaining what the weapon actually does. And please don't skip this part, because for the Haalvu there's a lot going on below the surface, and you do need to know all of it to be able to make proper builds. So, let's check it out. At first glance, the Haalvu is simply a fully automatic assault rifle. With its regular fire, that's what you get, and it is fully hit scan, even though it might look like there are physical projectiles. However, the more interesting part would be the alt fire. When you press the alt fire button, you will transform the weapon in a way that it loosens its barrels, which will then start floating around you and function as auto turrets. The way this works is, when you hold down the fire button in this mode, then these barrels will target up to 4 different enemies at the same time and start automatically firing at them. Only restriction here being that the enemies need to be in a cone in front of you, as well as within 10-meter range. If you're further away, the weapon will not auto-lock on anymore and simply fire at where you're aiming. So yeah, this is already a very cool feature because it essentially allows you to attack all the enemies around you without having to aim at all. Only downside to this alt fire being that you consume 50% more ammo. Isn't really that bad though. Looking at the magazine though, we have another specialty, because the Haalvu has always infinite ammunition in the form of one rechargeable magazine. If you completely empty it, then you will have to go through a reload animation. However, if you have a little bit of trigger discipline and just go off the fire button for a bit, then the magazine will basically instantly refill itself. This, by the way, goes for both the normal as well as the alt fire. Now, speaking about the magazine, there is one more interesting thing that I noticed and I want to mention it. Given the fact that it is a rechargeable magazine, that means it unfortunately does not work with Cyto 9's resupply. You just cannot pick up ammo with the Haalvu. However though, if you now think that similarly to Incarnon weapons, elemental imbuements just don't work on it, then you would be wrong. See, for example, with Araxia here, you can still imbue the weapon with an element, and it will also recharge its magazine if you do so. So, if you want to craft a build that deals separate damage instances through an imbuement, then you can still do that. With all that being said though, let's take a look at the weapon's stats, and this is where we get to the actual selling point of the weapon. See, what I'm talking about here is the damage type that it has, because the Haalvu is very rare in that it deals pure Tau damage. And not only Tau damage, it is also able to inflict Tau status, and quite a lot of it. Looking at the stats, we have a little bit of a difference between the main fire as well as the alt fire, where the main fire has a pretty heavy focus on crit with a very good crit multiplier, whereas the alt fire with the auto-aiming turrets isn't really all that strong in the crit department, but therefore comes with increased status chance. And as we're gonna see later, this is very important. But okay, before we go on to the various builds that I'm going to show you in this video, there is one last very important thing to go over because it makes or breaks the entire weapon, and that would be the Tau status effect. What Tau does is very unique. For every Tau status that you have on an enemy, you will increase your status chance against the affected enemy by 10%. This caps out at a maximum of plus 100% when you reach 10 Tau procs. The special thing about this though is that this status chance increase is multiplicative to the final status chance of your attack. So as an example right here, in the background I use a chromatic blade on my Excalibur, and you can see the amount of status effects that it deals by default, as well as the amount of status effects with 10 Tau procs. As we notice, with 10 Tau procs, aka plus 100% status chance, we are effectively doubling the amount of status that we put out. This makes the Haalvu ridiculously strong because there's barely any weapon in the game that can inflict Tau, and not only does the Haalvu do that, but super efficiently in a larger AoE thanks to the auto-aiming turrets. However though, there is one key limitation with this Tau effect, and that would be that the increase to status chance only applies to sources of status that are moddable and not to sources of status that are force procs. What does that mean? It means that if you have a Warframe ability that force procs a certain element, then inflicting Tau will not all of a sudden give you 2 force procs. It won't do anything. Same goes, by the way, for certain melee attacks, let's say, that force proc slash, or maybe elemental imbuements that always force proc a certain element per hit. In all those situations where a status effect is guaranteed, Tau won't increase that status output at all. However though, in situations where the status chance is moddable, like for example on your weapon, including exalted weapons, or on certain abilities that have a status chance which scales with ability strength, in those situations, Tau does influence it, and we're also going to take a look at a pretty broken build later that fully capitalizes on that. Just very important that you keep this in mind so you don't get disappointed if your Protea doesn't deal double the heat now. And as always, if you could leave a quick like for the video, that'd be really helpful with the YouTube algorithm, so thank you so much for your support. But okay, now that you have all the information that you could possibly need about the Haalvu, let's start talking about builds. And in this video, I actually have quite a lot of those prepared. So how about we start out with a simple viral heat one. If you want to use your Haalvu without bells and whistles, without needing external buffs or yada yada yada, then this right here is your standard basic build. We're going for viral heat, and that is a very strong combination because the Tau status effects increase our status output by a lot. The first thing we do here, of course, would be putting viral and heat on the weapon, with Malignant Force, Rime Rounds, as well as Hellfire. As every good weapon, we're of course going to go with more multi-shot, and Galvanized Aptitude will not only give us status chance, but also more base damage. Because we have heat, and heat is a damage over time status, we're going to go for a faction mod if we're going up against a faction that has one, because not only will it increase our damage in general, but also the heat damage over time effects will double dip and therefore increase the damage further. If you're going up against a faction that does not have a faction mod, then this right here would be a flexible slot for something like maybe even more base damage with Serration, or you could also go for more fire rate with something like Primed Shred that will give you fire rate as well as punch through, also very nice on the Haalvu. In the Arcane, I chose to go for Primary Crux because it massively increases our status chance even further, as well as also giving us ammo efficiency so that the 50% higher ammo drain in the alt-fire mode doesn't hurt all too bad. In practice, you can play this build with the alt-fire, however it will perform much better if you use the main fire mode and focus all your damage on one single target. In general, it's a good all-rounder build, however, you would need a little bit of external buffs to make it truly shine. Someone like Saren as an elemental damage buffer, or Nidus/Harrow for the crit buffs would be a very good synergy here. However though, given that we have Tau, and therefore increase our status chance massively, one thought that I think we all had would be Blast. So let's take a look at a Blast version of the build. Also here, we focus on a lot of status chance with Primary Crux, as well as Thermite Rounds and Rime Rounds to get the blast that we need in the first place. Also here, we go with multi-shot, as well as more status chance from Galvanized Aptitude, but to get the most damage out of Blast, we're not only gonna go for faction damage, but also for an Elementalist mod. The only problem with this build is that for Blast you want to have a ton of fire rate, while at the same time you still need some crit to gain the damage that you want. The way I personally solved this is, I went for only crit damage without modding the crit chance, and then my crit chance comes from my choice of Warframe, where I personally use Nidus with this build. You could also do Harrow, I personally though prefer Nidus. If, however, you have a different setup, then no problem. In this case, you would just replace Primed Shred with the crit chance mod and outsource the fire rate to something like an Arcane on your Warframe or whatever. Also here, if the faction you're up against does not have a faction mod itself, then replace this one with literally anything else, maybe the Primed Shred here, and use Roar as an infusion on your Warframe. This is actually very important because to make this Blast build work, you really want to have the Elementalist and you really want to have the faction damage at the same time. All in all though, this Blast build I would say it can be very strong, but it desperately needs a Warframe to buff it up because the weapon itself does not have the power all by itself. However, if the alt fire isn't really your cup of tea and you just want to have sustained single target damage, then I have some Acuity builds for you. It might sound a bit counterintuitive, but Acuity is actually pretty strong on this weapon. The first one example build here would be a blast build, but this time in an Acuity version. We go for primary Acuity to massively increase our crit chance against the enemies, as well as the weak point damage to them. We then combine that with primary Deadhead because the headshot multiplier that it gives scales multiplicatively with the 350% headshot multiplier from primary Acuity and is therefore a very strong combination. Also here, we go for Blast because Blast is very strong on Acuity builds, and I personally decided to combine that with Vile Acceleration for the fire rate. You could also go for Prime Shred, you could also outsource it to the Warframe, everything that we previously said. If you wanted to, you might also add a Galvanized Scope to further increase your crit chance. However, I personally think that fire rate is much more necessary on a blast build like this. And in case blast Acuity is not for you, then you might as well go for Viral Heat Acuity, which does not fit into the text box here. Nice. However though, before we end the video, let's also talk about the most broken thing that I could get out of this weapon, the build that drowns the entire room in masses of status effects. Let's talk about the Jade Star synergy. Now, first of all, I want to mention that I'm not the first one to have the idea to put Jade Stars on the Haalvu. I've seen Moog as well as Kai do it before. However, I cooked up a synergy today with Nidus that I haven't seen anyone else do before, and it is just absolutely ridiculous, so let's get right into it. What we do here is we infuse Jade Stars from Sirius and Orion as our helmet on Nidus. Remember how I said earlier that the Tau status effects from the Haalvu only increase status chance from sources that are moddable? Well, it just so turns out that Jade Stars is one of the very few abilities in the game that doesn't force proc, but actually has a moddable status chance. As you can also see right here, my Nidus has a lot of ability strength, so the Jade Stars have 300+% status chance. Due to the fact that the Jade Stars are moddable, we end up in a situation like this. If I cast my Jade Stars and then hit the enemy with a normal shot, then they should inflict somewhat of like 3-4 heat procs because of the 300% status chance. Pretty self-explanatory. However though, if I first inflict 10 Tau procs, then cast the Jade Stars and shoot, we all of a sudden get twice the amount of heat procs because the 10 sentient effects double our status chance, which means that we have now somewhere between, 6-7 per hit. And as you can clearly see in the background, if we just lock in with our Haalvu, then the amount of status that we inflict is a little bit very insane. However though, that is just the beginning. Before we get into the Haalvu build itself for the synergy, we need to first talk about our Nidus, because for this synergy it is very important that you run this specific Nidus. This right here would be the build, and there are a couple of things that I need to explain because they might look off at first. The first thing being that we're going with Parasitic Vitality, not Archon Vitality. Reason for that is that for some reason, Archon Vitality doesn't double every heat proc that we deal with Jade Stars, but only seems to add like 1 on top of how many ever we deal with the skill. This way, Archon Vitality isn't really all that strong, and the added health and survivability from having 30,000 HP or so that you get from Parasitic Vitality is just much more convenient. Also, another thing to mention would be that we're not using the Teeming Virulence Augment. This is usually crazy busted strong because it scales with ability strength, but for this synergy, our main damage will come from the Jade Stars and the Haalvu is just our support tool. That's why we don't need this. As for the rest of our build, it's pretty simple. We max out ability strength as hard as possible so that we have a bunch of status chance on our Jade Stars. The only reason why we're not going for Precision Intensify, therefore Umbral Intensify, is that we also need our third ability. Let me explain. When we have a free-moving companion, like my Pansavalpa Phyla right here, then what we can do is use our third ability to link ourselves to that ally. As you can see up there in the corner, we now have 81%. This is an ability strength multiplier, which means that our ability strength of 300-something% is now increased by 81% on top. multiplicatively. So basically, we're running round about 600% ability strength now. This is the main kicker because it means that if we now activate our Jade Stars, we're all of a sudden going to inflict 6 hits per hit, right? We doubled our status chance from 300% to 600% just by having that link up. That is the reason why we go for Umbral Intensify, because we need to make sure that both the third as well as the fourth are supplied with decent strength. However though, now that we talked about Arnidus and we talked about the companion synergy, we can finally talk about the Haalvu. By the way, just in case you care, this right here is my Panzerwelperpfeiler build. It doesn't matter for today's synergy whatsoever, he just needs to be there so I can link to him. That's all we need him for. The Haalvu itself now looks very strange. We have a build that I call Tau Spread, and this build is incredibly weak. In fact, you're probably not going to kill a single Steel Path enemy with it, but you also don't need to. The whole point of this build is to only use the Alt Fire to spread as much Tau status effects as possible. If you wanted to, you could also go and add Viral into the mix to weaken the enemies even further. I personally think though having the maximum Tau spread is the best thing you can do for this synergy. The main purpose of this build is very simple. We activate our Alt Fire so that we have the auto-aiming turrets, and then we simply run through the enemies, and as you can see, they all basically instantly get 10 Tau status effects on them. This means against all those enemies, our heat procs from the Jade Stars are now doubled. If we now go and add our companion Link into the mix, which doubles our status chance, and then we prime all the enemies around us, and then we activate Jade Stars against them, then you will see that one hit of the Jade Star will deal 12, 24, I don't know how many status effects, and remember it's all in an AoE and bada bing bada boom, they're all already dead. Yeah. Again, quick explanation of the build. We go for as much status chance as possible, as well as multi-shot and fire rate. Prime Tread is nice because it gives us punch through as well, however you will notice a severe lack of galvanized mods. Reason for that is that we're not going to stack them up because we're not going to get any kills, which means we're going to focus on the normal versions as that is all we can really do here. As you saw though, this is more than enough to absolutely clear everything, and if you have Jade Stars and if you have the Haalvu, then you should absolutely test this out in the hands of Nidus with the 600% ability strength that you get from the Parasitic Link. But okay, that was quite a lot of builds. And if anything of that resonated with you, then you might want to know where you can get the Haalvu for yourself. And, well, the sad thing here is that you unfortunately just can't right now. That's right, similarly to 2 years ago, the Haalvu was an exclusive drop for watching at least 30 minutes of TennoCon last weekend on Twitch. If you did that and you linked your Twitch account to your Warframe account, then you should already have it. However, if you missed the con, then right now there's no way to get the weapon and it's also not tradable. However though, there is a light at the end of the tunnel. See, 2 years ago, we already had a similar situation, with the AX52 being dropped throughout the TennoCon showcase for the 1999 update. Also there, if you missed it, you couldn't farm the weapon in the game. However, once the 1999 update itself launched, they re-implemented the weapon to be farmable so everyone can get it. And also for the Haalvu, they already confirmed in this week's dev short that it will be reintroduced into the game, saying with a little wink, in a more appropriate position. Given the fact that the Haalvu is a sentient weapon, and our end-of-the-year update will send us to the sentience to Tau, that makes it pretty obvious that the Haalvu is going to return as a farmable item in the December update. And now, also check out these crazy boss killer weapons for the more tougher-to-crack foes. Another massive shoutout to Demon Lord Zell, Demon Emperor, Emperor Prime, Lost Linux Gaming on the Kaneo 2, Pepper Wolf, Mihaki, Socrates the Almighty Rat, Leo Morizaki, Antares, Pate Crusader, Boomiya 1, Save, Alwindai, Zengen, Quax, Blue Eagle 98, Hearthwield, Everin 8802, Gabriel Tevez, Jaco Ivan Gonzalez, GE Schnoz, Muffdisk, and all other generous channel members for your continuous support. We see each other, hopefully in the next one, and until then, as always, good loot.